In the pre-dawn cold of a Detroit industrial yard, where the air tasted of burnt oil and decades of rust, a young CEO stood before the last container her father ever touched. She signed the destruction order without hesitation, a clean line through the past. But as the overhead crane swung the engine from its steel tomb, the single father working nearby went completely still. He recognized what hung before him in the gray morning light, not scrap metal, but the prototype that had vanished from every engineering record in America 10 years ago. And her father had never failed. If you have ever been written off because of where you came from or because you stayed quiet when the world expected you to fight back, this story will reach somewhere deep. The salvage yard stretched across 4 city blocks on the western edge of Detroit, a place where the bones of American industry came to be forgotten. Steel carcasses of stamping presses and cylinder heads sat in rows under a pewter sky, frost glittering on their surfaces in the thin November light. The facility belonged to a liquidation firm that had contracted to handle the bankruptcy estate of Hale Dynamics, one of the most talked-about engineering companies of the previous decade, now reduced to a line item in a court dossier. Workers in orange vests moved between aisles with clipboards, marking lots for shredding, the mechanical grinder at the far end of the yard already groaning to life. This morning was the final day of clearing, and everything that remained would be gone by noon. Catherine Hale arrived at 7:45 in a dark wool coat, her breath making small clouds in the cold. She was 27 years old and carried herself with the deliberate control of someone who had been managing other people's discomfort since she was a teenager. As the sole heir and newly instated CEO of what remained of Hale Dynamics, she had spent the past 14 months doing the one thing her father had never been willing to do, making hard decisions without sentiment. The press had been merciless when her father, Roland Hale, had died 18 months earlier, cycling through the same set of obituary phrases: visionary, reckless, cautionary tale. One business journal had simply called him the man who burned $1 billion chasing a dream he never proved. Catherine had read that line once, set the magazine down, and never read it again. The last container held components from Project Prometheus, her father's defining obsession and, in the opinion of almost everyone who had followed the company's collapse, the direct cause of its destruction. Engineers, investors, and analysts had dissected the failure for years. The conclusion was always the same: Roland Hale had poured 12 years of capital and credibility into a propulsion system that could not work, and when the money ran out, he had taken the company down with him. Catherine had heard this story so many times that it no longer felt like grief, it felt like weather, something cold and permanent that she had simply learned to dress for. She signed the destruction authorization at 8:03, handed the clipboard back to the site manager, and turned toward her car. 3 rows over, Wyatt Mercer was lying on a creeper board beneath the differential housing of a 1984 cab-over truck he had been commissioned to restore for a private collector. He was 32, lean in the way that people who work with their hands all day become lean, with engine grease permanently seated in the creases of his knuckles. His tools were organized with a precision that looked out of place for a man operating out of a rented bay in an industrial salvage yard, calipers beside socket sets, torque specs handwritten in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Grace, his 6-year-old daughter, was bundled into her winter jacket and perched on an overturned plastic milk crate nearby, working through a picture book with the focused seriousness that she had inherited entirely from him. She had been coming to work with him since she was 4, and the yard workers had long ago stopped noticing the small girl with the dark braids who always had a book. Wyatt heard the container doors before he saw them open. The sound, 2 heavy locking bars thrown back in sequence, was ordinary enough, but something about it made him roll out from under the truck. He rose to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on the rag tucked through his belt loop, and looked across the yard to where the crane had begun its lift. The engine housing emerged from the container the way a secret surfaces after long burial, gradually, and then all at once. Wyatt stood very still. His eyes moved across the asymmetric combustion chamber geometry, the closed-loop thermal recirculation ports, the hand-stamped identification codes running along the secondary manifold in a shorthand that only a handful of people in the country would have recognized. His lips parted. He said, barely above a whisper, "There is no way." He actually finished it. Wyatt Mercer's life in the years since Hale Dynamics had the simplicity of a man who had made a deliberate choice to disappear. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Hamtramck, drove a 2007 pickup that he maintained himself down to the wheel bearings, and charged fair rates for repair work that he executed better than shops with 5 times his overhead. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept his sidewalk shoveled and never had anyone over. The women at Grace's school knew him as the father who always arrived on time, always packed a real lunch, and never offered explanations for why her mother was not in the picture. He did not explain because it still cost him something each time he tried. Grace's mother, Dana, had died of an undetected cardiac condition when Grace was 11 months old, and Wyatt had sealed that grief away in the same internal compartment where he kept everything else he did not allow himself to touch. Grace had her mother's eyes and her father's patience, which was a combination that made the adults around her slightly uneasy. She asked careful questions and waited for real answers. That morning, watching her father go rigid across the salvage yard, she climbed off her crate and walked to where he stood. She studied his face the way she studied problems in her picture books, looking for the logic behind the answer. "Dad," she said, "do you know what that is?" Wyatt put one hand briefly on the top of her head, the way he did when he was buying time, and said they needed to get back to work. Grace looked at the engine housing for another 3 seconds, then walked back to her crate. She had learned not to push before he was ready. The reason Wyatt recognized the prototype had nothing to do with salvage work. 12 years earlier, he had been 20 years old and 3 semesters into a mechanical engineering program at Wayne State on a partial scholarship when he had sent an unsolicited analysis of a published thermodynamic paper to the research division of Hale Dynamics. He had not expected a response. Roland Hale had personally called him within 48 hours. Within 6 months, Wyatt had taken a leave of absence from school and was working as the youngest member of Project Prometheus's core team, a small group of engineers who understood that what Roland was building was not simply a better engine, but a closed-loop thermal recovery system that could recapture and convert waste heat at efficiencies the industry had not come close to achieving. The implications were significant enough that Roland had kept the core team deliberately small, communicating outside the main company channels, compartmentalizing the work in ways that even his senior staff could not fully map. Wyatt had spent 2 years on that project, and they were the 2 best years of his working life. Then the shutdown came. Roland called the team in one morning and told them the project was being suspended. He used the word suspended, not canceled, and that they were being transferred to other divisions or let go. No explanation beyond liability and capital constraints. Within a week, the servers were wiped. The lab was cleared, and the official company communications were already describing Project Prometheus as an experimental program that had failed to produce viable results. Wyatt had stood outside the emptied lab and felt something close to nausea, because he knew with the specific certainty of someone who had held the calculations in his own hands that the project had not failed. It had been stopped. He had carried that knowledge for 12 years like a stone in his chest, too heavy to put down, too compromised to share. And now the final prototype was hanging from a crane 30 yards away while a woman in a wool coat walked toward her car without looking back. Catherine Hale had grown up in a house where the dinner table conversations were mostly Roland's monologues about combustion thermodynamics and fuel recapture ratios, and where the family vacations existed as theoretical future events that never quite arrived. She did not hate her father for this. She had, for a long time, simply accepted that he was a different category of person, one for whom the physical world of family meals and school performances was slightly less real than the world inside his head. It was only in the final years, watching the company implode under the weight of a project he refused to abandon, that acceptance had curdled into something harder and colder. She had been 13 when Roland first described Project Prometheus to her in terms she could understand, a system that could make internal combustion fundamentally more efficient by recovering what every engine since the beginning of the automobile age had simply thrown away. She had been 20 when the company began its public death spiral, and 22 when Roland himself died of a stroke in the hospital where he had spent his final 3 weeks, still asking the nurses about his laboratory. By the time Catherine inherited the remains of the company at 25, she had already grieved the version of her father she had once believed in and replaced him in her internal accounting with a simpler, more manageable figure, a man of genuine intelligence who had been fatally unable to distinguish ambition from delusion. The 14 months of her tenure had been an exercise in controlled demolition. She had settled the most pressing creditor claims, renegotiated supplier contracts, and quietly allowed the board to prepare the company for acquisition. The one concession she had refused was any attempt to rehabilitate Roland's legacy, not because she was cruel, but because she had watched what hope in that direction had done to him, and she had no intention of repeating his trajectory. The destruction of the Prometheus components had been her idea, and she had insisted on overseeing it personally. There would be no artifacts, no salvageable materials for competitors to reconstruct, no symbolic relics for journalists to photograph and attach to think pieces about failed visionaries. She wanted it gone. Back at her car, she was checking her phone for the morning's meeting schedule when the site manager's voice came over the radio at his hip. She heard it through the open window of his truck, parked nearby. There was something about Container Lot 7. A buyer. She turned around. A man in work clothes was speaking with the site manager near the crane, his posture composed but his expression carrying an urgency that did not match the ordinary rhythm of the yard. He was holding something, a folded piece of paper, some kind of offer. The site manager looked uncertain, which itself was unusual. Catherine crossed the distance in 30 seconds. The man turned to face her, and she had the brief, discerning sense that he was not surprised to see her, even though they had never met. Wyatt introduced himself without reaching for a handshake. He said he was interested in purchasing the engine housing from Container Lot 7. He named a figure, $400. Catherine looked at him for a moment, then at the engine, then back at him. She thought, scrap buyer. She thought, this takes 30 seconds. She said yes. The transaction was completed before 9 in the morning, the site manager noting it in the clearance log with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen stranger things in a salvage yard. Catherine watched Wyatt load the engine housing onto the flatbed of his truck with a care that was several degrees more deliberate than any piece of scrap metal warranted. He used a come-along and 2 lengths of chain, securing the housing at 3 points and checking each connection twice before he climbed into the cab. She noticed that his hands were not entirely steady. That detail stayed with her as she drove away, small enough to dismiss, particular enough to remember. Wyatt pulled the truck into his rented bay at the far end of the same facility and used the hydraulic lift table to transfer the housing to his workbench. Grace, who had ridden in the cab, climbed down and stood at the edge of the work area with her arms folded across her chest, a posture she had developed as a way of signaling that she was paying close attention without being in the way. Wyatt laid out his inspection tools in a clean line and began systematically working through the housing's external condition. The casting was intact. The ceiling surfaces had surface oxidation but no structural damage. The thermal jacket had been improperly stored and had some delamination at one end, but the core appeared sound. The more he examined it, the more his initial recognition deepened into something more complicated. This was not simply a prototype. This was the final iteration, the terminal build, the version Roland had been working toward for more than a decade. 3 neighbors and 2 yard regulars stopped by over the course of the morning to look at what Wyatt had brought home, as they always did when he acquired something out of the ordinary. The consensus was skeptical. One man who ran a parts resale operation out of the next bay told him he had spent good money on what looked like a custom fabrication that would have no resale market. Another offered to help him cut it for scrap value. Wyatt thanked them both and returned to his examination. He was used to this particular variety of commentary, the reflex certainty of people who assessed value by what they already recognized. It was late afternoon before he found the discrepancy that changed the nature of the project entirely. The secondary thermal module, a component roughly the size of a hardcover book that housed the control logic for the recirculation system, was missing. Not removed carelessly, the mounting hardware had been cleanly unbolted, the connection points sealed with precision caps. Someone had taken it deliberately and professionally. Without it, the prototype was a demonstration model at best, impressive geometry, correct construction, but not operational. Wyatt sat back on his stool and thought about who had possessed the access and the knowledge to perform that removal, and only one name came to the front of his mind. He was running a swab over the inner face of the control housing when he noticed the engraving. It was shallow and deliberate, cut into a surface that would not have been visible until the housing was fully disassembled, no more than 2 inches of hand-cut text in block letters. He angled his inspection light toward it and read the words once, then a second time, with the specific stillness that accompanies the moment when a long-held suspicion stops being a suspicion. The engraving read, "If they erase me, finish it." He set down the swab very carefully. He sat with those 5 words for a long time before he said anything at all. Project Prometheus had begun, in Roland Hale's private notebooks, as a question that a second-year engineering student would have been embarrassed to ask aloud. What happens to all the heat that conventional engines discard? The answer was well understood. The majority of the chemical energy in liquid fuel was released as waste heat through the exhaust and cooling systems, representing a fundamental inefficiency that the automotive industry had essentially accepted as the cost of doing business. Roland had not accepted it. Over a period of more than a decade, he had assembled a research team to develop a system he called a closed-loop thermal recovery architecture, a method of capturing exhaust side heat at the molecular level, converting it through a series of phase-change materials and thermoelectric arrays, and reintroducing the recovered energy into the combustion cycle. The efficiency implications were not incremental. They were transformative. Independent projections from 2 of the engineers on the project, including Wyatt, in a private technical memo he had written at age 21, suggested that a fully realized implementation could achieve thermal efficiencies that would make current electric drivetrain technologies look, in direct comparison, like an intermediate step rather than a destination. The reason this was dangerous was not technical. It was economic. The capital held in battery supply chains, charging infrastructure investments, and fuel cell research pipelines across several major corporate interests represented hundreds of billions of dollars of committed money. A technology that rendered the core assumptions of those investments obsolete would not have been welcomed. Wyatt had understood this in the abstract when he was working on the project. What he had not understood at 21, and what had taken years of retrospective thinking to fully assemble, was that someone inside Hale Dynamics had understood it too, and had moved accordingly. The sequence of what had actually happened looked different from the inside than it had from the outside. From the outside, the story was clean. Roland Hale, a brilliant but increasingly erratic founder, had spent years and enormous capital on a system that did not work, had refused to acknowledge failure, and had driven his company to bankruptcy through a combination of stubbornness and delusion. That version of events was documented in creditor filings, analyst reports, and a 4-part investigative series that had run in a national business publication 2 years after the company's collapse. Wyatt had read every word of that series sitting at his kitchen table in Hamtramck, with the particular focus of someone reading a description of himself that was both recognizable and entirely wrong. From the inside, the sequence went differently. Approximately 11 months before the official project suspension, the external data servers where the team stored non-classified work product had been accessed by a user profile that Wyatt later traced, in the informal way that people with technical ability trace things when they are not being paid to do so, to a third-party consulting account that had been activated and cancelled within a 72-hour window. The data accessed in that window included the thermal calibration matrices for the phase change layer, the single most critical piece of information in the entire system architecture. 3 months after that access event, a new patent application had been filed by an energy research subsidiary registered in Delaware, covering a thermal management method that bore a structural resemblance to work the Prometheus team had done 2 years earlier. Wyatt had found that application by accident while doing unrelated research on heat exchanger design, and he had sat with it for 4 days before he allowed himself to reach the conclusion that the resemblance was not coincidence. He had thought about going to Roland. He had even drafted the conversation in his head on several occasions. But Roland had already been under siege from his board by that point, already being pressured to show results or accept outside restructuring, and Wyatt had no hard evidence, only a pattern of timestamps and a technical similarity that a good attorney could reduce to unverifiable speculation. And then, before he could act on any of it, the project had been shut down. 3 weeks later, Wyatt had been handed a severance check and walked out of the building by security, the same as everyone else. The engraving in the control housing changed everything, because it meant Roland had known. He had suspected, perhaps more than suspected, that his work was being taken from him, and he had left a message inside the one component that only someone who understood the architecture of the system could ever have found. He had not been defeated. He had been waiting. For 12 years, in the cold dark of a container in a salvage yard, the proof of a man's life work had been waiting for the right person to pick up the thread. Catherine received the notification about the prototype on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the salvage clearance. The message came from the firm's legal coordinator, who had flagged an anomaly in the clearance log, a line item from container lot 7, showing a buyer on the morning the authorization was signed. It should have been a trivial matter, the kind of loose end that gets cleaned up with a single call. Catherine made the call herself because she had not forgotten the way Wyatt Mercer's hands had moved when he secured the load on his truck. 20 minutes of research later, she was in her car heading west. She found the address easily, the same salvage facility, a rented bay at the far end. She expected to find a vehicle up on blocks, maybe a pile of disassembled components laid out for part resale. What she found instead stopped her 3 feet inside the bay entrance. The engine housing sat on a heavy work table, fully disassembled into its component subsystems, each piece laid out on clean shop cloth in a sequence that indicated not random salvage but systematic engineering analysis. Diagnostic cables ran from a laptop computer on a rolling cart to 3 points on the thermal jacket. A set of hand-drawn schematics covered an entire section of a whiteboard mounted to the wall, annotated in a precise technical notation that Catherine recognized with a physical sensation she could not immediately name. It was her father's shorthand. The exact shorthand, the same notations from the engineering books she had grown up watching him fill. Wyatt was bent over the main assembly with a bore gauge, and he straightened when he heard her enter. There was a moment of mutual assessment. Grace was doing her homework at a small folding table in the corner, and she looked up, looked at Catherine, then back at her work with the practiced neutrality of a child who had learned not to react to adults arriving unexpectedly in her father's space. Catherine said that Wyatt had run a diagnostic on the system. It was not a question. Wyatt confirmed it. She said her father had employed a full engineering team and 8 figures of capital, and they had not been able to produce a stable output. Wyatt looked at her steadily and said, "Your father's team was working with a sabotaged thermal calibration set. The data they used in the last 2 years of the project had been altered." Catherine's response was immediate, a reflex of anger that had been sitting behind her sternum for years, activated by anyone who tried to rehabilitate Roland Hale at the expense of the documented record. She said that was not a credible claim. She said the failure was verified and exhaustively reviewed. She said he should be careful about making accusations he could not substantiate. Wyatt did not raise his voice. He crossed to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and drew a single diagram, the thermal calibration curve as it had existed in the original project data, and beside it, the curve as it had appeared in the final testing records that formed the basis of the official failure determination. The difference between the 2 lines was small. It was also sufficient to cause every validation test in the program to fail. He circled the divergence point and set the marker down. Catherine stood very still, looking at the 2 curves, and the anger was still present, but it had developed, in the past 30 seconds, a small structural fracture. Sebastian Cross had occupied the position of Chief Operating Officer at Hale Dynamics for 9 years, having joined the company when Roland had been at the peak of his credibility and stayed, with the flexibility of a man whose own interest remained consistently aligned with whatever the situation required, through the entire arc of the company's decline. He was 51, possessed of the particular smoothness that accrues to people who have spent decades navigating corporate politics at the level where favors are currency and documentation is liability. The board regarded him as a stabilizing force. The acquisition partners valued his continuity knowledge. Catherine tolerated him because removing him during active negotiations would have created complications she did not currently have the bandwidth to manage. What no one in the current corporate structure knew, what only a small number of people had ever known, and fewer still were in a position to prove, was that Sebastian Cross had spent the summer of the year the Project Prometheus servers were accessed having a series of private meetings with the executive leadership of a company called Meridian Energy Systems. Meridian had been a mid-tier player in the thermal management space at that time, holding a defensible but not dominant position in the commercial vehicle sector. 2 years after those meetings, Meridian had filed a patent for a thermal recovery method that bore a structural resemblance to work the Prometheus team had completed years earlier. 3 years after the filing, Meridian had been acquired by a major European conglomerate for a figure that made the transaction one of the more notable clean energy deals of that decade. Sebastian had not been a named party in any of that, but he had held a consulting agreement with a Delaware LLC that had held a minority stake in Meridian at the time of the acquisition, and the proceeds from that arrangement had been distributed through 3 intermediate structures before arriving in a family trust registered in Colorado. He had believed, for 9 years, that the architecture of this arrangement was sufficiently layered to be effectively untraceable. He had believed it more fully after Roland died, removing the one person who had looked directly at him in those final months with an expression that suggested the old man had put at least part of it together. And he had believed it still, with the automatic confidence of someone who has never been seriously challenged, until his assistant flagged an item in the clearance log. The final Prometheus prototype had been purchased from the salvage facility rather than destroyed. Sebastian had moved quickly. A private investigator located Wyatt Mercer's rented bay within 24 hours. The instruction passed through a contracting firm he had used before for what the invoices described as competitive intelligence support was straightforward. Retrieve the housing and any associated documentation, and do it quietly. The men arrived at the salvage yard on a Wednesday night, well after midnight. They forced the bay door and took the laptop. They took the hand-drawn schematics from the whiteboard. In the process of moving quickly through the space, one of them knocked a metal storage shelf into the propane fitting on the bay's portable heater, and by the time anyone noticed the smell, a section of the back wall was burning. The fire department contained it to the bay and the adjacent storage area. Wyatt had been called by the yard's night security at 2 in the morning and arrived to find Grace beside him in the truck's cab. She had been at his apartment, and he had not been willing to leave her with anyone at that hour, just in time to see the fire crew pulling back from a structure that was no longer in danger but was no longer whole. Grace stood beside him holding his hand, looking at the damaged bay without crying. It was Wyatt who had to work to keep his face neutral. His tools were gone. The laptop was gone. The schematics were gone. The prototype housing had been on the lift table, and the lift table was in the section that had burned. He was still standing in the parking lot, the ash smell settling around them like a second blanket over the cold. When his phone rang, it was Catherine Hale. She said she had been thinking about the 2 calibration curves since she left the bay that afternoon. She said she needed to see him again. Then, after a pause that had the weight of something she had been deciding for a long time, she said she thought she knew where her father's module was. Roland Hale had kept a private storage unit in a climate-controlled facility in Ann Arbor, rented under a separate legal entity, paid in advance for 5 years, with Catherine listed as successor access holder in an envelope that had been handed to her by his attorney as part of the estate administration. She had opened the envelope, noted the address and access code, and placed the information in a file folder where it had remained untouched for 18 months. She had assumed the unit held personal documents or equipment too sentimental to discard and too complicated to deal with during the chaos of the estate process. She had not been ready to find out which. She went on the Saturday following the fire, and Wyatt drove her in his truck. They rode for most of the 40 minutes without speaking, in the way that people sometimes communicate more accurately through silence than through any available language. Grace stayed with a neighbor. Catherine held a canvas bag in her lap and had left her phone in the truck's cup holder when they went inside, which was the first time Wyatt had seen her set it down voluntarily. The storage unit was approximately the size of a one-car garage and contained the kind of order that belongs to a person who had been making careful decisions about what to preserve. Along one wall stood a row of labeled archive boxes in Roland's handwriting, each date stamp, each sealed. In the center of the floor sat tool chest with combination locks on 3 drawers. On a shelf at the back, wrapped in an antistatic blanket and secured with 3 bungee cords, was a module approximately the size of a hardcover book with a brushed aluminum housing, custom connector pins, and a serial number stamped on the base that Wyatt recognized before Catherine finished unwrapping it. He picked it up with both hands and held it under the fluorescent light for a long moment. Then he set it down on top of the tool chest and told Catherine they needed to go through the archive boxes before they left. They were there for 4 hours. The boxes held 12 years of project documentation, primary test data, handwritten derivations, calibration logs, supplier correspondence, and 4 external hard drives sealed in individual plastic cases. But it was the video file on the 3rd drive, labeled only with a date that was 3 weeks before Roland's stroke, that made Catherine stop being careful about her face. The recording was 41 minutes long and had been made on a camera mounted on a tripod in what appeared to be this same storage unit. Roland Hale, visibly thinner than Catherine remembered him, with the specific tiredness of someone who has been under sustained pressure for a long time, sat in front of the camera and spoke quietly and methodically about Project Prometheus, about what he had built, about what he had come to believe had been done to it, and about why he had continued to work in private after the official shutdown. He named Sebastian Cross once, with the care of a man who understood that precision was more useful than emotion. He said, "If you are watching this, something has happened that I could not prevent. But the work is real. The work is complete. And whoever is watching this, if they understand what they are holding, they will know what to do." Catherine sat on the floor of the storage unit after the recording ended and did not speak for a long time. Wyatt sat on an overturned box nearby and let the silence continue, because there was nothing to say that would have been more useful than time. When she finally spoke, her voice was level in the way that things are level after the worst of the storm has moved through. She said her father had known. Wyatt said yes. She said he had not been trying to escape from them. He had been trying to protect the work. Wyatt said he thought that was right. She was quiet for another moment, then she stood, tucked the control module under her arm, and said they had a lot of work to do. They worked for 3 weeks. The new bay, rented at a different facility across town, had better ventilation and better lighting, and the equipment Catherine funded brought the workspace up to a standard that Wyatt had not operated in since his years at Hale Dynamics. Between the documentation from the archive boxes, the control module, and his own detailed memory of the project's technical architecture, the reconstruction moved faster than either of them had expected. The thermal calibration matrices were rebuilt from the primary data rather than the corrupted version. The phase change layer was re-indexed against the original derivations. The control module's firmware was verified line by line against Roland's handwritten logic trees. Grace fell asleep in the passenger seat of the truck on the nights that ran past 10, and Wyatt would carry her up the apartment stairs without waking her and go back down to check the day's test figures before he slept. Wyatt and Catherine said almost nothing that was not technical for the first 2 weeks. And then, in the third week, they started talking in the margins about Roland, about what they had each understood of him separately and failed to share, about the gap between the person the world had decided he was and the person the archive boxes proved he had been. Catherine told Wyatt about the vacation that had been planned and canceled every summer for 6 years. Wyatt told her about the morning Roland had called him at 7 in the morning to talk through a thermal boundary problem, and how, at the end of an hour-long conversation, Roland had asked him whether his scholarship application had come through, because he had written a supporting letter and wanted to know if it had helped. Catherine had not known about the letter. The acquisition offer for Hale Dynamics had been formally submitted on a Tuesday, with a 30-day response window attached. The acquiring party was a holding group with documented ties to the same sector where Meridian Energy Systems had once operated, a connection that Catherine had noted and spent several days deciding what to make of. Sebastian had presented the offer to the board with the practiced neutrality of a man describing facts rather than advocating for outcomes, although his advocacy was present in the framing of every sentence he chose. The board had responded with the cautious enthusiasm of people who have been managing decline long enough to recognize a dignified exit when one is offered. The vote had been scheduled for the final day of the response window, a Thursday morning at 9 in the company's downtown conference facility. Catherine arrived at 8:55 with Wyatt beside her. He was wearing clean work clothes, a dark canvas jacket over a gray shirt, no visible grease, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the permanent stain at the base of his left thumbnail that no amount of cleaning entirely removed. He was carrying a hard-sided equipment case. Catherine carried the 4 external drives from the archive and a printed summary document her attorney had reviewed the previous evening. She had not told Sebastian or the board that she was bringing anyone. She had not told them what she intended to present. She had simply confirmed her attendance. The conference room held 22 people, board members, legal representatives, the acquisition team and their advisors, and Sebastian, who was at the far end of the table and who registered Wyatt's presence with a stillness he controlled within 2 seconds, but which Catherine, who was watching for exactly that response, clocked without any visible reaction of her own. She introduced Wyatt to the room as a former project engineer from Hale Dynamics with material technical information relevant to the company's current valuation, and she said she would need 20 minutes. There was polite skepticism, which she had expected, and a brief sidebar between Sebastian and one of the acquisition team's legal advisors, which she had also expected. The board chair, a 63-year-old man named Franklin Doyle who had been a genuine friend of Roland's before the company's troubles had made friendship complicated, nodded at her and said to proceed. Wyatt set the equipment case on the table and opened it. The prototype had been rebuilt to operational specification on a compact test rig that fit within the case dimensions. It was not a full-scale demonstration. The configuration was not suited for that, but it was sufficient. He connected the diagnostic output to the conference room's display system and powered the unit on. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when the people inside are not yet sure whether they are witnessing something or nothing. The thermal sensors came online. The phase change layer began its cycle. The efficiency curve on the wall display climbed past the threshold that current hybrid technologies achieved and kept climbing. One of the acquisition team's engineers, a man who had been sitting with his arms crossed throughout the morning, slowly unfolded them and leaned forward. Another engineer picked up her phone, then set it down without making a call, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Wyatt spoke for 11 minutes. He explained the system architecture without simplifying it, using the full technical vocabulary, trusting the engineers in the room to follow and the others to understand from the numbers on the display that what they were seeing was real. He explained the closed-loop thermal recapture methodology, the phase change conversion layer, and the efficiency figures across the operating range. Then he put up the data comparison, the original calibration curve and the altered one, and explained, in the same quiet register he had used throughout, what the difference between those two lines meant, and precisely when it had appeared in the project record. He named Sebastian Cross. He referenced the patent filing timeline. He presented the data access logs from the server breach 11 years earlier. Sebastian stood and began saying something about unverified data and defamation liability, his voice carrying the slightly elevated pitch of a careful man who has just realized the structure he has trusted for a decade has a load-bearing failure at its foundation. Catherine let him speak for exactly 15 seconds before she placed the printed summary document in the center of the table, stood, and said, in a voice that was completely clear and without heat, "My father did not fail. He was robbed, and I have brought you the proof of both." What followed was not a single clean moment of resolution. Institutions protect themselves from clean moments through legal process and procedural review, all of which serve legitimate purposes and all of which take time. But the sequence of consequences that began in that conference room moved with the particular momentum of disclosures that are both technically verifiable and institutionally embarrassing, which meant it moved faster than comparable matters usually do. Sebastian Cross was placed on administrative leave by the board within 72 hours, pending formal review. The review engaged outside counsel, which engaged a forensic accounting firm, which began the work of unspooling the consulting arrangements and the Delaware LLC and the family trust registered in Colorado. The acquisition offer was withdrawn by the acquiring group 2 weeks later, a decision made with a terseness that confirmed what Catherine had suspected about the link between the acquiring party and the interests that had originally moved against the project. 3 separate attorneys contacted her office within the month representing parties with standing to intervene in what was developing into a multi-jurisdictional inquiry. She retained her own counsel and cooperated with the aspects of the process that served the company's interests. The press coverage, when it came, had the quality of a narrative reversal that journalists find compelling. The disgraced visionary vindicated, the hidden antagonist revealed. The daughter who had believed the worst about her father forced to revise everything she had used to organize the preceding years of her life. Catherine gave one interview to a technical publication that had covered Hale Dynamics throughout its history, in which she spoke carefully about her father's work and declined to characterize the situation as a personal triumph. She said the company intended to develop the prototype technology through a formal research partnership. She said she wanted the record corrected because accuracy mattered, not because she needed the world to apologize. Wyatt was offered a position 3 times, once by Catherine directly, once by the board through an intermediary, and once by one of the engineers who had been in the conference room that Thursday morning and who had since made calls to people who made calls to people. He declined each offer without drama. He was not ungrateful for them. He understood that the people extending the offers believed they were giving him something he wanted, and the confusion was sincere, and he did not hold it against any of them. He simply understood the difference between the work he had loved, the actual problem-solving, the early morning calibration runs, the notebook full of handwritten derivations, and the work that came after it in most institutional settings, the meetings and the org charts and the management of other people's expectations. He had no desire to trade the first category for the second. Catherine drove out to the new bay to see him in person after the third refusal. She arrived without a prepared agenda, which she recognized as something she was not practiced at. They stood on either side of the workbench where the prototype had been reassembled for one of its last times in that space, and she asked him, without framing or lead-up, why he had gotten involved at all. He thought about it for a moment, not performing the consideration but actually having it. Then he said, "Because some people deserve to have the truth told about them, even if it comes too late for them to hear it." A year later, the research center opened on a gray October morning that looked, to those who remembered, almost exactly like the morning the crane had lifted the prototype from the salvage container. It occupied a converted industrial building 4 blocks from the original Hale Dynamics campus, and above its main entrance a steel plate was engraved with the words Roland Hale Entity for Propulsion Research. Inside, in the lobby, the original prototype housing sat behind tempered glass on a low pedestal, not the rebuilt operational unit, which was in the working laboratory on the second floor, but the first housing Wyatt had pulled from the flatbed of his truck and cleaned with shop rags at 3 in the morning while Grace slept on a folded drop cloth in the corner. A small placard on the base of the display case read, in plain letters, "The engine they call junk." Grace had grown 2 inches and lost 2 front teeth in the preceding year, and she navigated the new facility with the easy proprietary familiarity of a child who had watched something come into being from nothing. She moved between the workbenches in the main laboratory, greeting the researchers by name, occasionally sitting in on the morning stand-up meetings with the focused seriousness she had always brought to adult spaces. Wyatt had a workshop on the second floor, his own, equipped exactly as he specified, where he was currently working on a second-generation version of the thermal recovery architecture with 2 engineers he had chosen himself, after a series of conversations that had focused almost entirely on what they actually understood, rather than what their credentials claimed. Catherine stopped by on the morning of the opening to see him before the ceremony. She was no longer the version of herself that had stood in the salvage yard 18 months earlier, not harder or softer, exactly, but differently organized, as if something that had been holding rigid under accumulated pressure had been permitted to find its actual shape. She stood in front of the display case for a long moment, looking at the original housing behind the glass. Then Wyatt came up beside her and, without ceremony, reached to the activation panel on the side of the case and started the unit on its idle cycle, a low, continuous hum, steady and measured, regular as a heartbeat, and quiet as something that has been waiting a very long time to prove it was real. Catherine looked at the efficiency readout above the case. She did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that the numbers were not already saying more clearly. The most dangerous thing, it turned out, was not failure. It was not even the act of sabotage itself. It was the possibility that the world could be made to believe, systematically, convincingly, over years, that a man who had been right about everything had been wrong about it all. That the belief would be repeated until it became the record. That the record would outlast him. But it had not. The engine hummed in its glass case, and through the high windows of the lobby the October light came in clean and level, and somewhere down the corridor Grace's small voice was asking one of the engineers a question that was more precise than they had expected. And in the quiet of that morning, with the proof of a stolen genius running steadily and without apology beneath the name of the man who had built it, that was exactly enough.